Hello and welcome to the show that debates and reconstructs burning issues of the day. This is The Big Picture and I'm Athar Khan. The Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council or EAC said yesterday the Indian economy could bounce back next fiscal and has the capacity to grow at 7.5 to 8% with moderating inflation and a modest improvement in the investment climate. A projection that suggests that the worst is over. The council, which said the economy could expand at 7.1% in the year ending March, marginally higher than the 6.9% estimated by the Central Statistics Office. However, cautioned that the high level of the fiscal deficit, pressure on the balance of payments and fuel subsidies were downside risks to these projections. The EAC, headed by Dr. Rangarajan, had earlier projected the economy would grow at 8.2% in the current fiscal in its economic outlook last year. The economic review, however, also outlined a few concerns for the upcoming fiscal year. Gross fixed capital formation, signifying investment demand in the economy, is estimated to fall to 29.3% of the GDP in 2011-2012. That is a decline of almost 4 percentage points over the last 4 years. The EAC, however, argued that with the return of price stability, supportive policy measures, it is possible to visualize an improvement in the investment rate despite difficult conditions in the international financial markets. Price stability is also expected to normalize consumption demand, thus further boosting investment and growth. Tonight, on The Big Picture, we try and reconstruct the rather optimistic projections that the PMEAC has had come out with, and we'll try to understand the magnitude of the challenges ahead for the Indian economy. And to help us gaze into the crystal ball, joining me for the first time on The Big Picture in the studio is Dr. Vasanta Bharucha, former Economic Advisor to the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. And I would like to welcome back to the program Professor N.R. Bhanumurthy of the NIPFP and Priyaranjan Dash, Managing Editor of the Financial Chronicle. But I'd like to start the show with Dr. Bharucha, if I could. Now, the rate of growth in 2011 is estimated at 7.1%. That's what C. Rangarajan said yesterday, slightly higher than the CSO's projections. Do you share Dr. Rangarajan's optimism? And if yes, give us a sense of why that is.
Well, one who knows the method of compilation of GDP statistics knows that the CSO estimates normally when they are revised, slightly marginally higher, I think my colleagues on the panel will approve this, normally a little higher than the originally envisaged estimate. So, from that point of view, it is not much to, it's a marginal 0.2% of GDP is not a very significant or a striking deviation from the original estimate. However, for the next year, which is 7.5 to 8, that seems to be a slightly taller order given, of course, the present situation. And of course, Dr. Rangarajan's committee, the Advisory Council, Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister, has projected this growth on the strict understanding, it's more a conditional growth, that fiscal consolidation would be there and there would be de-subsidization process in place in terms of both fuel subsidies and the control of fertilizer prices. So, since it's a conditional kind of a thing and assuming inflation doesn't get out of hand and goes higher. So, given these, I guess the situation is understandable.
Right. Mr. Dash, I'd like to ask you this. Do you share what Dr. Bharucha just said? Is Dr. Rangarajan's optimism warranted at all?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think she's put her finger
on the pulse.
Yes. It's insofar as the current financial year is concerned, the PM's Economic Advisory Council started with a projection initially of around 9% of GDP growth.
Right.
And they revised it to 8.6% and then a second revision to 8.2%. And now they say after the Central Statistical Office has come out with an advance estimate of 6.9.
Right.
Now they say that they are still hopeful that the year will end with 7.1%.
Right.
Now, I'm not, it's a small increase, and like Dr. Bharucha just mentioned, that invariably one sees that this kind of a little variation when the final figures come, you will have it slightly up. But in today's context, for the current financial year, actually one is afraid whether that 6.9 would move downwards. In that case, the variation that is being projected by the PM's Economic Advisory Council
would also be visible.
Yes, number one. Number two, insofar as the next year is concerned, I won't be as charitable as she was. I would say it is wishful thinking, completely removed from the reality, current realities. And the policy prescriptions which have been made, conditional, yes, to be fair to the council, they have definitely said that all these set of conditions have to be met in terms of policy. But one needs to be realistic and see what are the chances of actually those things being accomplished.
Right. Professor Bhanumurthy, wishful thinking for next year, do you agree?
I think one needs to really see the fine print, although the press and some of the summary of the report says that it's going to be 7.5 to 8%, the fine print says that actual growth would be around 7.6%. It's lower side of the band that is being highlighted. And it's not very inconsistent with the kind of current economic climate that is existing in the country. In fact, my own forecast, which I made it in November 2011, I said it's going to be 7.4%. I just recently revised it down to 7.2%.
So you're very close to what Mr. Rangarajan is saying.
Yes. But the point, as ma'am said, and Mr. Dash also told about their first projection that they made in July, that is 8.5 or slightly upward bias that they said. Even that time we said 7.8%. I think we were the first to say 7.8% in the month of April. I mean, I'm not taking much credit out of that, but if you're going forward, 7.6, I would say that, as ma'am said, it's only the conditional forecast, and it all depends on the kind of investments that economy is going to see. And it also depends on the kind of decline that we see in the overall interest rate structure.
Right. Fair point. Dr. Bharucha, international conditions, economic conditions worsened throughout 2011. Now, how important do you think that the international scenario, the global economic slowdown, if it takes a turn for the better, how would that benefit India, and would that benefit India at all?
The slowdown improves, you mean?
Yeah, if it takes a turn for the better.
Yeah. Well, I think the linkages these days, global linkages for any country's economic growth cannot be wished away as we used to do earlier in the past.
We're not that insulated anymore.
We are no longer insulated, and we are affected. Even during the financial crisis, which global financial crisis about 4 years back, which hit the major economies on the western side, these did affect India as well, even though we came out of it much better, and we insulated ourselves little more because of our regulatory mechanism being stronger. However, if we again look at the global picture in terms of the factors which are expected to govern a better growth in 2012-13, I think there are two sub-segments which are projected to be more important, namely FDI, which is inward FDI, foreign investment
coming
in
into
India.
the country, yes.
Second is FII, investment through the FII. Now, if these two factors are the ones which are pinned up, then we have to see that if the other economies do better and the investment opportunities and the returns are better in other economies, whether we can count on the high growth projected in this, because what they have projected is more than double of what we have achieved in the current year. So it seems to be on the higher side. And the third one, of course, along with this is the inflation part of it. And the foreign exchange rate, I mean the rupee value. Now these two are again not insulated, because as they say, normally we import inflation in some extent.
Fair point. Let me just interrupt you very quickly. Very briefly, Mr. Dash, before we go into a break, the IMF says the US economy could grow at 1.8% this year. Does a spurt in the US economy, does that necessarily mean it's good for India? Do you agree? Very briefly, if you could.
Well, there are linkages, and she just told you what the linkages are, and if the US economy improves, surely it's going to help India. But our problem is not so much with the global factors. The problem basically is, why did I say it's wishful thinking? That is primarily because if you look at the investment rate in the economy, which the economist would call gross fixed capital formation, that's been on a decline for 4 years to 29.3%. Now, with 29.3%, when it is fallen below 30%, you got a growth rate of less than 7% this year.
Right.
Now, unless that investment rate improves dramatically, given the productivity of capital in our country, which is the which is called I-core,
Right.
the economists call it, which is around 4.
Right.
Now, given that, the mathematics simple mathematics would show you that you cannot go beyond 7%.
Right. Fair point.
So
fair point.
that's the issue.
Right.
And one has to look at why is the investment rate down for 4 years. 1 percentage point in each year.
Right,
It has gone 4%.
We'll come back to that. I'll come back to you, Professor Bhanumurthy, but we'll take a short break right now. Lots more to discuss. We'll discuss the nitty-gritty of the report that Dr. Rangarajan released yesterday. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back. You're still with the big picture. Professor Bhanumurthy, let's talk about the services sector. Dr. Rangarajan in his report, in his press conference yesterday, mentioned the services sector. Now, the growth of GDP in the services sector was 9.6% in the first half of 2011-2012. Now, the council expects the service sector growth will continue to be strong and will close the year at 9.4%. The services sector has sort of been the sole shining light in an otherwise stark scenario. Why do you think that is? And where do you see that the services sector going forward from here?
Yeah, I think if you see the forecast for the next year, the only sector that you see which the council is predicting lower than the current fiscal year is service sector. And as other panelists have said, the service sector is dependent on many factors, not just domestic factors and also the international factors. The international factors, I would say for the next year, as it looks even in the European zone, that it is not really going to be a much rosy picture compared to what we had seen in the last year. At the first half of in the current year, we had a much better service sector growth, but the second half is the one which actually the whole drama is played out in European zone. And some kind of negative impact could be to some extent mitigated if the US economy is going to grow more than 1.8% as IMF has projected. I think the initial trends that's coming out from US is that it's going to be much higher than 1.8%. Also, you know very well this is the election year for them, and it's not very different from Indian elections.
They have to cater to their constituency.
They have to get it. I think the President Obama is definitely see that it's going to be much more than 1.8%.
Right.
So that is expected to have some kind of a positive impact on the services. But I think the net is going to be much lower because of the Eurozone crisis.
Right. Mr. Dash, coming to you, let's talk about the current account deficit for a while. Dr. Rangarajan outlined yesterday it could be a problem area. We have to maintain that it doesn't overshoot the prescribed limit. Now, for this year as a whole, the balance of payment position have been very tight, and the CAD is expected to be around 3.6% of the GDP. Now, how crucial is it for the government to make sure it does not overshoot that prescribed limit, and what options does the government really have at this point?
See, it would appear that when we talk about current account deficit, we are talking about the external sector and over which the government or we may not have any control. That's not true. When we talk about the current account deficit, why is it widening? That is one of the primary reasons why current account deficit is widening is because government is living beyond its means.
Absolutely.
That is the fiscal deficit or the budget deficit that you can talk about. That is what is contributing to it. Number two is, I'll just get back to the point that I was making about investment rate being low. Why is it low? Because of two things. One is government is saving. Number two is even households.
Saving is declining.
Household savings have declined because financial instruments do not give you the return. They give you a negative return because of the high inflation. And so household savings have gone into gold. Now, when household savings have gone into gold, you have had $48 billion of gold import. That is where your current account deficit is. So all these things are beautifully linked. And so we can actually, if, we didn't have for several years, we had current account deficit well below 2%. In 1991, when we had a massive crisis on the foreign exchange, on the external front, current account deficit was in fact little more than 2%. Today, we are 3.6%, and we say that it is manageable. That is because we are getting capital inflows. People are coming in to invest in this country. You find that to be manageable.
Right, right.
That doesn't mean that we shouldn't attend to the current account deficit.
Right.
To attend to current account deficit, we'll have to look at the government's saving, and we'll have to look at how to encourage private, that is household savings.
Right, right. Let me get in Dr. Barucha
Into
here.
financial
Let me get in Dr. Barucha here. You've been advisor to the government before. What options does the government really have? How do we do what Mr. Das just said? That's, of course, it's needed, but how does the government get around to doing that?
Well, the options are limited, but one has to have a political will. That is where the problem occurs. That, as the other panelists said, definitely the government is living beyond its means. Second is, if we look at the earlier budgets, whenever we agree to some increase in expenditure and so on, including, for instance, the government administrative expenses, we had linked it to a reduction in government expenditure over a 5-year period. Now, unfortunately, I don't think this is taking place, number one. And number two, perhaps nobody is monitoring whether it is taking place or not. And number three is that whichever is the area where the government would like to reduce this deficit, perhaps the political compulsions make it difficult for them.
And there are elections in 4 states
Yes,
this year. It's
correct.
going to be doubly
Correct.
difficult for the
As
government.
such, they say that the petrol prices could be further enhanced, but for the 5 state elections which are in progress. Now, some measures may be announced immediately after the elections. And secondly, on other grounds also there are problems, and of course there are compulsions of a coalition government which they have whenever they want. Even when they want to have FDI enlargement, then there is a political compulsion to retreat. What happened in the case of retail FDI? The government had to retrace the steps. So the compulsions are
Manifold.
many.
Manifold.
At the same time, the policy should be where the report, though of course I have not read the full report, where it mentions is all this is achievable. What do you need for it? You need a very broad, detailed strategy, number one. Number two, policy initiatives. And number three, instruments to achieve the fiscal consolidation. Now, in all this, except saying that fertilizer subsidy, for particularly decontrol of this urea prices, number one, and then desubsidizing diesel prices, or to at least reduce the subsidy. Nobody talks of income tax of agriculture, which is a radical measure, and then they will say it is a state subject. But when it comes to security, we can step in to the states. I mean, this is also a certain logic.
Fair point. Time for one more break, but it's interesting you mentioned diesel prices and as well as LPG. That's exactly what we'll talk about after the break. Lots more coming up. We'll discuss LPG, kerosene, excise duties as well on the other side of this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're still with The Big Picture, and I'm still discussing the PMEAC report, economic review that was released yesterday. Professor Bhanumurthy, if I could come to you. The PMEAC has also advocated that the government should increase prices of LPG as well as kerosene at the central level and electricity tariffs at the state level. Do you see the central government or the state governments biting the bullet, especially considering that these could be what you call unpopulist measures in the coming year? Do you see that happening at all?
Well, just before that, I would like to say one small thing. I mean, one needs to appreciate this report. This is a government report with a government emblem, and the council is saying that there is a downside risks are very much there in the system, particularly the kind of deficits, which they are reflecting to the very bad years of 1991.
Right.
And in terms of fiscal deficit, we say that we are close to 2001 kind of situation. I think one needs to appreciate that. And regarding this subsidy component that you're talking about, maybe particularly on the diesel, the government would be able to do some extent now that once your UP elections are over. And these are the suggestions which have been given to the government for quite some time. And the council report is only reiterating all these demands once again.
Professor Dash, I beg your pardon, Mr. Dash, what's your thought on LPG and kerosene and raising electricity tariffs? Would you think the government's going to do it at all?
The finance minister says that he is losing sleep over these subsidies.
The subsidy burden.
And then he went on to say, no, not on the subsidy, but the way it is not being delivered to the targeted that he is losing. So both tasks are difficult.
Right.
You know, if he has to improve the delivery mechanism, that's not going to happen overnight.
Right.
And if he has to cut the subsidies, that's the prospects for that, politically at least, doesn't look very bright.
Right.
Now, as Professor Vanamurthy was mentioning, these recommendations have been made time and again by the Finance Ministry itself in its economic survey. The Finance Commission in its roadmap for fiscal consolidation, and now the PM Economic Advisory Council is doing it barely 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the budget is presented.
Right.
Now, has it got any value in terms of the government actually biting the bullet? I doubt it very much.
Dr. Bharucha, would you agree?
Well, I would only like to say that the inflationary pressure of increasing the diesel prices still exists. I think that has to be borne in mind, particularly because the report mentions the growth is achievable on the assumption that the industry, that is the manufacturing sectors, will almost double its growth.
Right.
Now, that may be a difficult task if diesel prices
That's
are
interesting that you mentioned that. The report also suggests, Professor Bhanamurthy, that raising excise and customs duties to the levels of pre-2008 recession would be a very good idea. Now, my figures tell me just by raising indirect tax rates to 12%, the government might just be able to mop up some 35,000 crore tax revenue. Now, if the government does raise these duties and taxes, how effective do you think will they be in reality?
No, I think the point that they are telling is the fiscal stimulus measure that you are given during the crisis, one needs to be reversible. I mean, they need to be reversed, like the way it happened in the monetary policy stimulus. Fiscal policy also need to revert back to the pre-crisis situation if you want to really achieve, you want to really be serious about fiscal consolidation. That is the small point that they are saying. Otherwise, in fact, the diesel is one of the biggest components of the overall subsidy. As ma'am said, there could be some kind of inflationary, but the cut in the subsidy component, if it is being switched to the capital expenditure, one would have some kind of a medium to long-term growth impact, which can actually bring down both inflation and also the fiscal deficit.
Right.
I just want to add one comment to supplement the panelists, is that we are talking about only transfers of resources from non-government sector to the government sector by raising all these taxes or restoring the pre-position. But what we need to see is where is the revenue generation coming from? Are we also equally tackling it? Because the growth depends also on revenue generation in practically all sectors. So there somewhere one is kind of not clear, unless we are going to have some disinvestment and which gives us bulk revenues.
Which hasn't happened in the current fiscal at all.
Well, we have very limited time,
Absolutely.
and unless we front load it in the next budget.
Right. Absolutely. I'd like to speak a little bit about inflation, the government's eternal bugbear, if I could call it. And now, the report yesterday said that by March, it'll be 6.5%, and by the end of the fiscal year next year, it should settle between 5 to 6%. Where do you see inflation going? Do you share the optimism of Dr. Rangarajan?
Well, 6.5% would not be really a surprise by the end of March. But I think the biggest risk that we're going to have for the next year is the kind of old oil prices. Again, it has come back to $120 per barrel. And also there is a stickiness in the kind of exchange rate that we are seeing. And And to some extent, there is also some kind of price build-up happening on the metals in the international market. In the sense, there are overall, in the international market, there is some kind of price build-up happening.
Right.
And we are not going to be immune to this kind of risks.
Mr. Dash, quickly, inflation, where do you see it going?
You know, I would agree completely with the
Professor
analysis.
Bhanumurthy.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. But you see, all these policy prescriptions which have been made are very good. But the proof of the pudding is in eating.
Absolutely.
You know,
absolutely.
whether, how to what extent
So we'll have to.
the government is able to adopt them. You know, there can be no argument about the tax GDP ratio, for instance. You're getting back to the pre-crisis level of around 12%. You know, so by rolling back excise of 2%, you'll get 35,000 crore. By expanding the service tax, you know, and with this negative list that the states have now agreed to, but that is also stuck. It's not nothing final about it.
Right. Mr. Dash, we'll have to end there. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. But as my panelists today agree, some tough measures needed to tackle the upcoming financial environment, in the economic environment in the country. Not just international factors responsible. We have domestic issues also to deal with. With elections over, we'll have to wait and watch whether or not government, the central government as well as some state governments do bite the bullet and employ these tough measures, these tough reforms, these policy prescriptions that have been in the air for so long. Thank you so much for joining us on The Big Picture tonight. Till next time, thank you, good night, and thanks for watching.